Well, thank you everybody again for the wonderful invitation to join you this year for all the different insurance commissioners across the country. It's always a pleasure to be part of this conversation. My name is Anthony Leiserowitz. I'm a faculty member here at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale Program on climate change communication. Really quickly, what we do is we study how do Americans and other people around the world respond to the issue of climate change. So what do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, consequences, and solutions to climate? How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts. What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And then what kinds of behaviors are people changing or willing to adopt in order to become, either to reduce their own carbon footprint, but particularly relevant for, of course, today's conversation is what are they willing to do to prepare for the impacts and protect themselves? Insurance being, of course, one of those very important things to do. Ultimately, as scientists, though, our real question is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, and political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue, others are apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, or at least they are here in the United States? We have a partnership program that does a lot of work with governments, with companies, with advocacy groups, et cetera, all across the country and around the world to try to help them solve their problems. So if you have certain communication challenges that you're facing, by all means, please contact us. We'd be happy to help. And then we also have our own climate news service called Yale Climate Connections, which includes a national radio program where we have a brand new story, a minute and a half long, that plays every single day on over 750 stations across the country, including probably the states in which you work. So let's just say it's this incredible resource of locally based stories featuring people talking about how climate change is already affecting us and the people and the places and the things we care about. But just as importantly, people who are demonstrating, role modeling how to be an active citizen, how they're rolling up their sleeves to take action on this issue. And that's everything from, again, governments to businesses to everyday people who are trying to be part of the solution. So anyway, I encourage you to check those out. So today I'm going to give us a quick update on what we're learning about climate change in the American mind. So a little context is we do 2 nationally representative surveys each year, and I'm going to share some of those national results, but I'm also going to show you this really amazing tool that we have called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, which allows you to see what's going on in your state or your city or your own county. So it's an incredible resource, and I'll show you a little bit of that later on. But let me just begin by, first of all, setting the context. And that is that it's really important to recognize that the vast majority of people are never going to have the equivalent of Climate Change 101, a full semester course, taught at the university level, to really dig in. Here's how the climate system works. Here's what the causes and consequences and solutions are, all those kinds of details. The vast majority of Americans are never going to have that level of understanding. Now, I'm not saying there aren't, in fact, millions of Americans who do want those details. There are, and it's incumbent upon those of us in the expert community to go more than halfway to meet them where they are and try to answer their questions as best we can. So there definitely is a role for that. I'm just saying, though, that in a population of over 300 million people, most people don't have the background, they don't have the training, they don't have the interest, they don't have the time to really get in and understand the details. So what I really want to focus on here is what is most important for people to know, okay? As a foundation. Is it vital that they understand exactly how the carbon cycle works? Probably not. Is it vital that they understand exactly how many parts per million of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere at any given time? Probably not. And in the course of our work and some of our colleagues around the country and around the world, we've identified at least 5 key ideas that we think anyone anywhere in the world should have as a basic foundational understanding. Now, again, if you're a water resource manager, you're going to need much more elaborate knowledge in how climate change relates to your day job. But again, I'm not talking about those specialized professions. I'm talking about most people. So moreover, we boiled those 5 key ideas down to just 10 words, but a friend of mine in Congress likes to do haiku on the side, so I'm going to give you her 11-word version instead. And here we go. The 5 key facts. Scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. Now, these are really simple. And in fact, that's one of their greatest strengths is that they're really simple. If you've ever played the party game of telephone, where you're sitting in a group of people around a table, and one person gets a card with a sentence on it, and then they have to whisper it to the person next to them, and it goes all the way around. Invariably, by the time it gets back to the original person, the message is completely garbled and means something completely different, and that could be a very amusing and funny party game. But of course, that's the real world of communication too, and that's why simplicity is actually an enormous strength. If the person next to you, okay, your friend, your family member, your coworker, your colleague, your audience, can remember what you said and can communicate it effectively to the people that they then talk to, that's the real test of an effective communication. So don't be afraid of simplicity. Simplicity is a real strength. But these are also deceptively simple. I like to call these meta ideas because each one of them can be backed up with tens, hundreds, thousands of pieces of evidence, examples, and stories buttressing this conclusion that you're ultimately trying to draw in the minds of your ultimate audience. Okay. Here are all the ways that we know that climate change is happening right now. Okay, we're taking measurements from the sun and orbital dynamics and the temperatures in the atmosphere and in the oceans and in the land surface and in the biosphere, and we're looking at the changes in behavior of plants and animals and so on and so forth. Like, we have so many lines of evidence that climate change is happening. Here's all the ways that we know that it's human caused. Of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years of Earth history. This time it's different. It's us directly digging stuff up out of the ground, coal, oil, and gas, and setting it on fire to power our societies and land use change. Those are the major reasons why this particular climate shift is very much in our control. Here are the thousands of ways that climate change is bad right now and going to get much, much worse if we continue on the current path. And then last but not least is that there's hope, which really is standing in for, we have so many wonderful solutions, not just to be invented. I mean, sure, we need people working on carbon capture, and if somebody has a line on cold fusion, give me a call. But we don't need them because we actually have most of the solutions we need already sitting on the shelf. Better products, better services, better business models, better policies. But what we need is to have the will, the public and the political will, to take them off the shelf and implement them in our lives as consumers, in our governments as policymakers, in our companies as business leaders, and so on and so forth. So it's really important that ultimately audiences understand and have a clear-eyed understanding of the risk, the threat that we all face. And that's, of course, something that you do day in, day out as part of your day job, is assess risk. But it's also vitally important that people understand what we can do about it. And this is what we call, from a psychological standpoint, a sense of efficacy, which really means that you know that there are solutions, that you or we collectively have the ability to implement those solutions. And most importantly, that if we do it, it will make a difference. Okay, so you really need both of those. People need to understand the risk, and they need to know what the solutions are, and that those solutions are going to be effective. That's really at the heart of what we're trying to achieve here on climate communication. Okay, so what's the current status of the American public? So again, as I mentioned, we do these nationally representative surveys every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall, and I've been doing that since 2008, so for over 15 years. So here I'm going to give you the full timeline, but I'll really focus in on some of the most recent data. So here you're looking at, do Americans understand that global warming is real, that it's happening? And what you can see here is that back in 2008, we were at kind of a high water mark at about 71%. That was followed by a huge 14 percentage point drop, bottoming out about 2010. Since then, it's been slowly working its way back up until, as of last October, so just a few months ago, we're actually just about to go into the field, so we'll have new data shortly. But we were at about 72%, so pretty close to an all-time high. So that's great. Good job, America. We're near an all-time high on this. But just to put this in a little bit of international context, if we were in Japan or Brazil, this number would be over 95%. So we clearly still have a ways to go in this country to even help people understand the simplest, most basic fact, which is that it's actually happening. Okay. All right, do they understand that it's human caused? Not quite so much. So again, back in 2008, it was at about 57%. Again, a big drop. Then since slowly working its way back up, as of last October, 58% of Americans understood that this is human caused, but you still have 29% who think it's natural. And that's a fundamental and important and consequential misunderstanding. Because if it's natural, then people conclude, well, then there's nothing we can really do about it. Like maybe we can try to prepare for some of these events, but they don't understand that this is actually a problem that we control the outcome here. And again, notably, it is the burning of fossil fuels and some land use change that is really the driving factors in this whole problem. So again, this is a really important fundamental fact that many people still have yet to truly understand. And what we also find is that there's been a real significant increase in people's understanding that scientists actually have reached a consensus about this issue. So we've been asking this question for many, many years, and you can see here in green that more and more people are convinced that most scientists think climate change is happening. So that's definitely a positive trend. However, as of last October, it's still only 53%. So it's just over half of Americans. And this is a really important misunderstanding. So you still have a quarter of Americans who think that there's still a lot of disagreement. And by the way, let's just be clear, we're talking about, do scientists think that climate change is happening and human caused, about which there is literally no scientific, serious, credible scientific debate about these fundamental facts. You know, what the impacts of climate change are going to be on the southwest monsoon weather pattern in the year 2080, sure, we got plenty of uncertainty about that. But about the fundamentals, is it real and is it human caused? There is no serious scientific debate. And yet, many Americans don't yet fully understand that either. And because most people know that they're not experts about this issue, they look to experts, including climate scientists, but also weathercasters, including also insurance leaders as well, because we're the ones that are supposedly studying this issue and are understanding why this matters. So it's just to say, your voice actually does matter quite a bit, because most Americans know they're not experts. They're looking to the scientific and expert community for guidance. And most of them haven't heard the fact that, yes, there's an overwhelming consensus that climate change is happening and human caused. And what we also see is that worry level. Now, this stands in for a whole bunch of risk perception questions, so about the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts. All of this is really at the heart of it is this emotional reaction of worry, that we become much more worried about things that we understand are a threat. And you can see that worry levels have in fact increased over the past 10 years. As of just last October, it was about 2/3 of Americans are at least somewhat worried, but only 29% are very worried. And one of the major reasons for that is that for many Americans, climate change is still seen as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, or distant in space. This is about polar bears or developing countries, okay? Not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, and not me. And so as a result, it becomes what we call psychologically distant. It just becomes one of 100 other issues that's out there. And yeah, I kind of hear about it every once in a while, but I don't understand why this is so important. I don't understand why this is so urgent that we take action, because in fact, time is really getting short in order to maintain the climate at a safe and stable level. So we still need to help people better appreciate the risks that we all now are already experiencing. And of course, are going to get much more severe in coming years. And yet, we do think, or we do find that about 6 in 10 Americans think that global warming is affecting the weather at least a little. Okay, so only 33% understand that it's actually affecting the weather a lot already. Another 22% think it's affecting the weather some, and 6% say a little bit. But you still have all these folks over here who say it's not having any effect, or they just simply don't know. So again, this is one of the places where it's the most direct, easily visible and experienceable for most Americans. And it's, of course, where it directly intersects with the entire insurance industry. As these extreme weather events, these billion-dollar disasters, which just keep getting worse and worse and worse year after year. So again, we're making progress here, but there's still 4 out of 10 Americans who don't think climate change is affecting the weather at all, when in fact, everybody, everyone in America has experienced extreme weather at this point that has been touched by climate change. And it's also important to recognize that many Americans just aren't really well prepared for this. So this is just about the question, do you have an emergency supply kit in your home? And 6 out of 10 Americans say they don't. Do they have a disaster emergency plan that all of their members of their family about? 72% say they don't. And we could keep on going. And I'm sure you've seen these kinds of numbers yourself, but it's just to say that we are still an unprotected, unprepared nation for dealing with the kinds of risks and threats that we're increasingly suffering with. Okay, so now let me turn to the Yale Climate Opinion Map. So many years ago, we would be showing these kinds of national results and people say, hey, this is great, very insightful, but I'm working in Texas. What can you tell me about Texas? And the answer was, I couldn't tell you much about Texas because no one had ever asked us to do a survey there. So we developed this really powerful and pioneering new tool that we call the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, where we can take our national data and develop very accurate estimates of what's going on at the state and local level, which has allowed us to now unlock the value of this for all the state and local decision makers across the country, because we can now tell you what's going on for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest metro areas, and 3,000 plus counties across the country. We've even pushed this all the way down to the census tract level, in particular for a project that was looking at extreme heat risk perceptions. Do people understand, which, of course, by the way, heat is the single biggest killer in terms of extreme weather events. So let me show you what I mean. So here's what we would normally be able to say about a national survey. 64% of Americans are worried about global warming. Okay, good to know, but maybe not so helpful if you're working in a particular location. So what does this look like when we look at the county level? So now you can immediately see that there's actually a lot of variation across the country. So basically, those counties that are darker red is where a larger and larger majority of the public understands, or I'm sorry, are worried about climate change. Whereas in darker blue is where it's a smaller and smaller minority of people who are worried about climate change. And so as you can see, again, not all parts of the country are the same. There's so many interesting stories and patterns in this map. I happen to really love this one, but let me just pick out one as an example, and that's the state of Texas. Now, in many people's stereotypical, perceptions of Texas is that it's a, very conservative, deep red state. It's long been led by climate-denying governors. It is the home of much of the oil industry. Seems like the last place you could have a constructive conversation about climate change. Turns out that's not true. And in fact, these counties right along the border here are actually more worried about climate change than most of the counties in so-called liberal California. What's going on there? Well, this dovetails actually with a longer body of work that we've been doing for many years, which also undermines another piece of common wisdom that people hold, which is they think that climate change is an issue that only white, well-educated, latte-sipping liberals care about. Turns out that's not true. It's actually Latinos who are the ones, the demographic in the United States that are the most convinced climate change is happening, that it's human caused. They're the most worried about it. They're most supportive of action, the most willing to actually get personally involved. Okay, and so what you're seeing there is that effect here, and obviously in Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, California, and of course many other places across the country. So it's just to say that these are the kinds of things that these maps can suddenly help us see in a way that we didn't and couldn't before. Okay, so let me come back to that sense of psychological distance again, because I really want to underscore how important that is. When we ask Americans, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? You see pretty much a majority of people in almost every single county in America, just a few counties over here in Georgia, a little bit up here in Alabama, oh, sorry, that's not Alabama at all. So anyway, just a few counties that do not think, where there's not a majority of people who think that global warming will harm plants and animals. Okay, how about people in the United States? Not so much. How about you personally? Much less. Okay, so again, underscoring this sense that for many people, climate change feels like this distant problem. And if it's distant, many presume that we can stick this one on the back burner and come and deal with it later, not realizing that the pot's actually boiling over on the back burner. So again, it's really important, especially for people in your position of the knowledge and knowing how this is already impacting people across the country, to help communicate that to your audiences so they better understand the risks that we now all face. The other important thing I want to bring to this is that, of course, there's not just a single audience. Americans don't have a single viewpoint on climate change. And for many years, people would say, okay, there's climate believers and climate deniers, and that's way too simplistic and not actually very useful. And in our work that we did even now 15 years ago, again, with our partners at George Mason University, we identified what we call global warming 6 Americas, 6 distinct audiences within the United States that each respond to this issue in very different ways. The first is a group we call the alarmed. These are people who are fully convinced it's happening, human-caused, urgent. They strongly support action. Okay, so they are the ones that are really paying attention and are very, very concerned about this issue. Then comes a group we call the concerned, 29%. These are people who think, yes, it's happening and it's human-caused and serious, but they still think of the impacts as distant in time and space. So again, they do support action, but they don't yet understand why it's urgent. Then a group we call the cautious, still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious? Is it kind of overblown? They're paying attention, but are basically still kind of confused. Then a group we call the disengaged, small, but I think important group that basically says, you know, I don't think I've even ever heard that term global warming before. I don't know what it is. I don't know what the causes are. I don't know what the consequences are. I don't know what the solutions are. And it's usually not any politics or anything like that that's getting in their way. They just lack basic awareness. Nobody in the media they watch or the social circles that they're part of is talking about climate change. Then comes a group we call the doubtful, and these are people who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's natural. Nothing humans have anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So they tend not to pay it much attention. And then last but not least is the group that we call the dismissive. And they're firmly convinced this is not real, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem. And the great majority of whom quite literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many other such kind of conspiracy type narratives. Now, importantly, they're 11%. They're only 11%, but they're really allowed 11%. They're really vocal 11%, and they're more than adequately represented in Congress. And so they have tended to dominate the public square to such an extent that the other 9 out of 10 of Americans who are actually totally willing to have a constructive conversation about climate change are often intimidated into what we call climate silence. People self-censor. They don't talk about climate change, even though they kind of want to, because they presume that half or more of the country is dismissive of climate change. They're not. Okay? And in fact, if you really boil this down to those in this community that will send the mean emails or the mean tweets or whatever, it's a tiny, tiny, tiny proportion of that 11%. So I'm not kidding when I say that we often are letting the last hair on the tail of the dog wag the entire dog. Okay? So one really important thing that we all have to do is just talk about it, because we talk about the issues that are important. And if nobody's talking about it, most people will just conclude then it can't be that big of a deal. Okay. So anyway, really important to break the silence. So we've then asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what would you ask? And so you can see that there are very different conversations happening in this country all at the same time. So the dismissive, their main question is still this question of, is it a hoax? And on a deeper level, why should I trust you? Whereas the doubtful and the cautious have the same question. So, okay, it's happening, but how do you know it's human caused? Okay, they're still at that fundamental fact question. The disengaged are still at the very beginning. They're still like, okay, is it even real? Like, is it a real thing? Whereas the alarmed and the concerned are both having this question of, well, what do we do? I got it. It's happening. It's human caused. It's serious. But what do we do about it? Okay, and we as a community have tended to do a much better job communicating the problem itself than we have the solutions. And yet there are so many wonderful solution stories to tell. Okay, and what we're also beginning to see among at least some of the alarmed is this second question, which is there still time? Okay, the answer is yes, there is, but it's not infinite. Okay, we are running short on time to limit climate change to 1.5 or more likely 2 degrees centigrade, which of course gets much, much worse as we get hotter and hotter. Okay, and then also just to say, we've been tracking how these opinions have been shifting over time. And so what you're looking at here is those 6 different groups and how they've changed in proportion to one another over the past 10 years. And so if you look back here in 2013, basically the alarmed and the dismissive, the 2 groups that are really the most engaged with this issue, most of the other ones are kind of just paying attention in a much less intense way. They were basically tied. About 15% of the country was alarmed, about 12% of the country was dismissive. So essentially for every 1 alarmed, there was 1 dismissive. Fast forward to just a couple months ago, and now 28% of Americans are alarmed about climate change, while still about 11% are dismissive of climate change. So you can see that there's been tremendous growth in the proportion of the alarmed. There's also been significant growth among the concerned. So just taking the alarm, though, that's now almost 3 alarm for every 1 dismissive. Okay, and that reflects a fundamental shift in the underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change. And it actually helps us really understand why the news media is now talking about climate change a lot more, why political action has been taking place on climate change at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. There's just far more engagement with this issue today than there was 10 years ago. And that's very much reflected and is in part driven by this underlying shift in the American population. So just to conclude with some recommendations, 1, you just got to start with fundamentals. Talk about it. Okay, we talk about the issues that are important. So, you play a really important role as a trusted messenger around these kinds of issues. You got to talk about it. Secondly, though, know your audience. Who are they? Okay, what do they understand? What do they misunderstand? Who do they trust? Where do they get their news and information? What are their underlying values? It's only once you understand who they are that you can go more than halfway to meet them where they are and help them take the next step in their learning journey, which is probably going to look very different than your learning journey. And I cannot stress this enough. There are many roads to Damascus. People can take their own pathway. Some people are going to come in through the door of science, and that's the path that's going to lead them to a true appreciation of what climate change means. Other people are going to come there through the door of health. My kid has asthma, and oh my gosh, now I'm understanding, and this is personally relevant to me because I'm realizing how climate change is making asthma attacks worse. Okay. Other people may get there through property damage. Other people might get there through economic opportunity or through their faith in their religion. That's all fine. Okay. So your job as a communicator is to help them take the next step in their journey, even if that looks different than the one that you personally went on. Third, this framework, Global Warming 6 Americas, is super helpful because it's true not just of the American public as a whole. It's true of farmers. Okay, farmers aren't homogenous either. There are some farmers that are alarmed about climate change. There are other farmers that are dismissive, and everything in between. You take any community, young people, older people, small business people, weathercasters, etc. You can understand that there's different audiences within any one of those communities. So I encourage you to use this as a strategic lens to think about who exactly am I trying to communicate with and what are the main questions that they need answers to. 4, there's no formulas here. This is human communication. It's not that simple, but this is a really useful guideline. Simple, clear messages. Repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often. And we usually forget that part. But it's so important to cut through all the other noise that people are being bombarded with. You've got to keep it simple, and you got to keep saying it over and over again for it to finally cut through and for people to really get it and say, oh, now I understand. And then also really important is that they hear it from a variety of trusted messengers, which can include you, or at least your community. And then here's our own suggestion for a simple, clear message. Scientists agree, it's real. It's us, it's bad, but there's hope. So all of our research is available on our website, as well as, of course, our Yale Climate Connections radio program and articles. There's lots of useful information there that I think should be very helpful to your community. So please come visit. And again, if you have challenges that you're facing, please by all means reach out and ask. We'd be glad to have that conversation. And with that, thank you very much.